Under the flickering streetlights in the cold, dark night, the ruthless officer handcuffs the mysterious girl amidst cries of anger and frustration, unaware that he has just awakened a storm of vengeance unlike any other. 20 years of bloody hatred, an oath carved in the shadows, and a dark secret capable of tearing apart both the sky of justice and his own life. Who is she, the one carrying a wound that will never heal? Will this officer survive when the horrific truth is exposed to millions of eyes? Don't blink for even a second. Hit subscribe now to step into the fateful battle that will send chills down your spine and haunt you forever. The sunset bathed the quiet neighborhood in a soft orange glow where the two-story houses stood close together. Neatly trimmed lawns lined the streets, and cars were parked in perfect alignment along the sidewalks. Mia walked slowly along the brick-paved path, her hands gently gripping the strap of her old handbag, its corners worn from years of use. A light breeze swept through, causing her to shiver slightly, but not from the cold. Her sharp eyes scanned every corner, every window, as if searching for or avoiding something. The familiar sounds of life filled the air. Children laughing from a neighbor's yard, the distant honk of a car, the clinking of someone closing an iron gate. But Mia didn't really pay attention to them. Her mind was heavy, thoughts twisting into a deep corner of her memory. Without thinking, she slipped her hand into the pocket of her jacket, her fingers brushing against something small, cold, and smooth. She stopped. The old silver ring. She pulled it out, turning it slowly under the fading light of the sunset. The surface of the ring bore tiny scratches, remnants of time. It was the only thing she had left of her father, the man she had lost so long ago. A stronger gust of wind blew through, carrying a few dry leaves that spun in the air. Mia clenched the ring in her palm, her gaze suddenly distant. But then she quickly shoved the ring back into her pocket and continued walking as if nothing had happened. She didn't want to think about the past, didn't want those old memories pulling her down. But no matter how hard she tried, there was something in her eyes, a deep sadness buried, yet never truly gone. Mia continued walking down the sidewalk, her mind still entangled with the image of the silver ring nestled in her jacket pocket. The weight of it, the reminder of a lost past, clung to her. But the moment was suddenly interrupted as she rounded the corner. A low, commanding voice sliced through her thoughts. "Hey, stop right there." She froze for a moment before slowly lifting her gaze. A tall, imposing officer stood before her. His uniform was crisp and flawless, exuding an air of authority that matched the cruel set of his jaw. The badge on his chest gleamed under the streetlights, catching the dying light of the sunset. Officer Davis. He was everything she loathed, arrogant, entitled, and dangerous. His eyes raked over her, searching, probing, as if she was a suspect, a target. It didn't take long for him to make his move. "Your bag. Hand it over," he demanded, his voice clipped and icy, the words dripping with condescension. Mia's grip on her bag tightened instinctively. She wasn't some weak, frightened woman to be cowed by a man in a uniform. Her voice came out low and unwavering. "You don't have the right to touch me. I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Davis's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing with a mix of annoyance and contempt. "I'm conducting a random search. Your refusal to cooperate tells me everything I need to know. You've got something to hide." His voice dripped with accusation, as if she were already guilty simply for existing in his line of sight. Mia didn't flinch. "Without a warrant, you can't touch me." Officer Davis's expression twisted in disbelief. Without warning, he lunged forward. His large hand shot out, seizing her wrist with brutal force, twisting it behind her back until she felt the strain in her joints, the sharp sting of pain. She let out a small gasp, but she didn't cry out. He growled, the sound of his frustration thick in the air. "Stubborn little," he spat, his grip tightening around her wrist, dragging her roughly toward him. "Let's see how long you can keep up this attitude when you're cuffed like the criminal you clearly are." Mia's heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to show weakness. She planted her feet firmly, refusing to be his prey, though the pain in her wrist was unbearable. But that didn't matter. She could feel his dominance, the way he tried to strip her of her power, to break her spirit. But she wouldn't let him. Not this time. The cold snap of the handcuffs echoed in the quiet of the night, locking around her wrist with a finality that sent a shockwave through her body. The metal bit into her skin, and she winced as the pressure increased. But still, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood tall, her breath steady, her gaze never leaving his. Officer Davis was furious now, his breath ragged with rage, his eyes burning with the need to break her. "Not so tough now, are you?" he taunted, his words laced with venom. He pushed her forward, shoving her roughly against the brick wall, pressing his body into hers with malicious intent. She could feel the weight of his chest against her back, the heat of his anger radiating off him. But she refused to let him see her fear. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Mia ground her teeth together, fighting the urge to retaliate. The rage inside her swelled, but she knew it wasn't the time. Not yet. Officer Davis leaned in closer, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You think you're so high and mighty, huh? You think you're above me?" He pushed her harder against the wall, the force making her stumble, but she kept her ground. He chuckled darkly. "Well, let's see how long you last, little girl." Her breath came in slow, controlled bursts, every muscle in her body tense, coiled like a spring. But her eyes remained fixed on his, unyielding. He wanted her to break, to cower, to beg for mercy, but all he would find in her was defiance. "You're not breaking me," she whispered, her voice cold and full of determination. "You're not the first man to try." Officer Davis's face twisted with fury at her words. Without warning, he shoved her harder, his hands now grabbing roughly at her arms, twisting and contorting them as if to break her. "You're nothing but a stubborn," he snarled, his voice filled with disgust. "You think you can get away with this? You think you can stand up to me?" Mia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't weak. She had fought battles before, and she would fight this one too. Officer Davis's anger reached its peak, but the one thing he couldn't break was her. She refused to be reduced to nothing more than a victim of his abuse. And in that moment, something shifted between them. He wasn't the one in control. She was. The interrogation room at the police station was cold and sterile. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights echoed in the otherwise silent space. The only other object in the room was an old metal table, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. Mia sat there, her wrist still bearing the angry red imprints of the handcuffs. Across from her, Officer Davis stood with his arms crossed, leaning casually against the wall, a mocking smile playing on his lips. He tapped his fingers on the table as if enjoying the moment, like a predator savoring the helplessness of its prey. "You think you can stand against me?" His voice dripped with contempt, his gaze sweeping over her, as though she were just another nameless cog in a system he had complete control over. "You think that by staying silent, you'll escape this?" Mia didn't respond. She just stared back at him, her eyes unwavering. She had faced men like Officer Davis before, those who believed their power gave them the right to do anything they wanted. But instead of engaging in his game, she silently reached into the pocket of her jacket, her fingers brushing against something familiar, the silver ring. In that moment, memories flooded back. A large office with towering bookshelves, the musty scent of old papers mixing with the subtle fragrance of sandalwood lingering in the air. The man behind the desk, his neatly combed salt and pepper hair and the somber judge's robe he wore, exuded an authority that was impossible to challenge. The light from the desk lamp reflected off the paper he had just signed, each stroke of the pen sharp and deliberate, like a decree that could never be undone. He placed the pen down, letting out a heavy sigh, his eyes drifting into the distance as if he knew that this decision would lead to something monumental. Mia blinked, pulling herself back into the present. She gripped the ring tightly in her palm, her voice barely a whisper, only loud enough for herself to hear. "Dad, I won't let you down." She wasn't the carefree girl she once was. Now she had a mission, something far bigger than herself, and she knew that her confrontation with Officer Davis was just the beginning. The courtroom at District Court Number 14 was packed that morning. The media wasn't paying much attention to the trial. It was just another routine arrest for them, another black woman accused of resisting arrest. But for those who truly understood the system, this was not just a trial. It was a carefully scripted play that the police and prosecutors had orchestrated thousands of times before, a place where truth was twisted, where power was wielded to crush anyone daring to challenge it. Officer Davis walked into the courtroom with a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered on his face. His uniform was impeccable, his hand resting on the belt where his gun once hung, a symbol of the authority he had used to maintain control over the streets. He took his seat in the witness stand, adjusting his badge as if to remind everyone that he was still a cop, still someone who had the power to decide the fate of others. The defendant deliberately hid drugs in her handbag. Officer Davis testified confidently, his eyes scanning the jury as he spoke, his tone unwavering as if it was an undeniable truth. When I asked her to hand it over, she immediately resisted, caused a disturbance, and forced me to subdue her. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair and a tailored suit, crossed his arms over his chest and raised an eyebrow as if looking at someone beneath him. "Your Honor," he said in a mocking tone, "this is hardly the first time we've seen a stubborn individual, one who thinks they have the right to defy the law." Clearly, the defendant thought she could openly disregard both the police and the legal system. A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, those who had long since become desensitized to the way this system worked. They weren't surprised to see a black woman dragged to court on vague charges while those in power stood there calmly, bending the truth without needing any real evidence. But Mia didn't react. She sat silently in the defendant's chair, her hands resting on her lap, her cold, sharp eyes locked on Officer Davis. She didn't argue, didn't quickly rebut, didn't show the outrage one would expect. She simply observed, calmly. And in that moment, something unsettled Officer Davis. He had been expecting anger, resistance, helplessness, the same emotions he'd seen in countless victims before. But Mia didn't look at him like a guilty defendant. She looked at him as if he were the one on trial. No one in that courtroom realized that from this very moment, Mia had already begun to take control, and she had a plan far grander than they ever anticipated. Mia's lawyer, a young man with an ill-fitting, wrinkled suit, stood up, clearing his throat with nervous hesitation. His hands fumbled with the papers on the table, the rustling of the files echoing in the otherwise tense silence of the courtroom. It was clear he was out of his depth, trying to find a solid point of rebuttal, but failing to steady his nerves. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "Your Honor," he said, his words small, almost lost in the vastness of the room. The judge, his eyes narrowing slightly, raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to speak louder. "My client, Miss Harrison, has clearly been treated unfairly. There is no direct evidence to show she hid drugs. Officer Davis may have overreacted." A soft but knowing laugh rippled through the room. A man in a black suit sitting near the back shook his head, his voice a low murmur. "Who's going to believe her now?" His words hung in the air, cutting through the lawyer's feeble defense like a knife. A middle-aged woman leaned toward the person beside her, her gaze sharp and judgmental as it flicked over Mia. "Look at her, like some homeless person just making up stories to get out of trouble," she whispered with a sneer. The whispers were quiet, but the venom in them was palpable, casting a shadow over the proceedings. The room buzzed with an unspoken agreement, a quiet assumption that Mia was guilty. It was the kind of judgment that was so ingrained in the system it barely needed to be spoken out loud. Officer Davis, seated in the witness stand, watched the exchange with a cold smile. His hands rested comfortably on his lap as he casually crossed his arms, a man who knew his position of power and was enjoying the moment. He leaned back in his chair, looking almost bored, his gaze flicking over to Mia with disdain, as though she were no more than an inconvenience, an obstacle in his path that he would soon overcome. His smirk deepened as he surveyed the room, pleased with the spectacle unfolding around him. "She doesn't have a prayer," he thought smugly, his eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "This is over before it even started." Mia, however, was the picture of calm. She didn't flinch, didn't react to the whispers or the mocking glances. She sat perfectly still in the defendant's chair, her posture straight, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her eyes never left Officer Davis for a moment, but there was no trace of fear, no hint of anger. Instead, there was only a quiet, unshakable resolve in her gaze. She made no attempt to refute the accusations or engage in the back and forth that seemed to be expected of her. There was nothing, just silence. The room around her seemed to pulse with tension, as if they were waiting for her to break, to lash out, to make a scene, anything that would validate their assumptions about her. They wanted her to be like every other person they had seen in that chair, trembling under the weight of the system, desperate to prove their innocence. But Mia did nothing. She simply observed, watching every movement, every word, every gesture with quiet precision. It was as if she was allowing them to play their parts, setting the stage for something larger, something more calculated. Officer Davis, still lounging in his chair, didn't notice the shift in the air. He was too busy basking in his sense of superiority, confident that the outcome was already decided. He was so sure that he had won, so certain of his position of power, that he couldn't even fathom the possibility that Mia wasn't intimidated by him, by the system, by anything at all. Her silence was just another piece in the puzzle he thought he had already solved. But in truth, Mia's silence was the most dangerous thing of all. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't defeated. She was waiting for them to make their move, waiting for them to expose themselves. She wasn't some helpless woman sitting in the defendant's chair. She was the one in control, watching, calculating. Her eyes were not filled with defeat or hopelessness, but with something much more terrifying: patience. Dangerous, deliberate patience. And as the trial continued, inching toward its inevitable conclusion, Officer Davis and everyone else in the courtroom would soon realize that they were playing right into her hands. They had underestimated her, and that would be their greatest mistake. Because Mia wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was preparing for something far bigger. A storm was coming, and they were too blind to see it. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy with tension as it was Mia's turn to speak. She slowly adjusted her posture, her eyes never leaving Officer Davis, who was still sitting confidently in the witness stand. The prosecutor crossed his arms, a smug smirk curling his lips as though he had already predicted the failure of her response. "Defendant, do you have anything to say about these charges?" Mia paused for a brief moment, her silence drawing out the moment like a sharpened blade. Then her voice cut through the tension, deep and clear. "You don't recognize me, but I know exactly who you are, Officer Davis." The words hung in the air like a knife, slashing through the suffocating atmosphere. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze for an instant. Officer Davis, who had been lounging comfortably just moments before, suddenly furrowed his brow. He tilted his head, his gaze flickering with a flash of confusion, but it was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a facade of calm. "What are you talking about?" he sneered, offering a hollow laugh, trying to maintain a mask of indifference. But his hand resting on his thigh tightened slightly. The prosecutor chuckled derisively, shaking his head as though Mia were just rambling, trying to stall for time. Low murmurs began to ripple through the audience. But Mia didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Officer Davis, her gaze intense, waiting for his response. Officer Davis could put on a show for the judge, for the jury, for everyone in the courtroom. He could hide behind his uniform, his status, his power. But Mia had seen it. A fleeting moment, a wave of unease, a tiny flicker of doubt he couldn't mask quickly enough. And that was all she needed. The cracks in his carefully constructed armor were already starting to show. He had underestimated her, and now the game had changed. The tension in the courtroom had already been thick, but as soon as Mia stood up, the room seemed to freeze in place. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table, trying to steady the trembling in her fingers. But when her voice broke the silence, each word hit like a punch to the very fabric of reality. "I am Mia Harrison, the daughter of Judge Robert Harrison, the man who put your father in prison 20 years ago for corruption." The courtroom exploded. Whispers erupted from every direction. Faces turned to one another in confusion, trying to process what had just been said. Officer Davis, who had always worn his air of calm control like a second skin, finally lost his composure. For the first time, his smugness faltered. He froze, eyes wide, his hand instinctively gripping the arm of the chair. "You? What?" His voice was hoarse, as if he couldn't believe the words he had just heard. The prosecutor flipped through his files in a hurry, trying to find something to grasp onto, while the judge slammed his gavel down with authority. "Order. I demand an immediate review of the records." A court clerk rushed out of the room, while the murmur of conversation continued to rise from the audience. Mia didn't look at anyone else. She didn't need to. Her gaze never wavered from Officer Davis, as if pulling him back into a past he had long tried to bury. And then memories from years ago came rushing in like a storm. A different courtroom, many years before. A tall man in a police uniform was dragged across the room by two officers, their grip tight on his arms as the room filled with angry shouts. He struggled, his voice rising in desperation. "I've been framed. I'm a loyal officer. I don't deserve this." But his voice was drowned out by the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. In the back row, a little girl, no older than 10, sat in silence, her wide eyes following the man, her father. Judge Robert Harrison sat directly in front, his expression cold, without a trace of hesitation as he handed down the verdict. Senior Officer Richard Davis, the man who had once believed he was untouchable, was convicted within the very system he had once manipulated. And today, 20 years later, his son, Officer Davis, was faced with that very truth. But this time, he was the one in the defendant's chair. Mia blinked, returning to the present. She could see the flicker of doubt in Officer Davis's eyes, the rare moment of unease he couldn't hide. But even as he tried to mask it, she knew this was only the beginning. The chaos in the courtroom erupted as Mia's declaration rang out. Officer Davis shot up from his chair like he had been electrocuted, his hands slamming onto the table, his face turning red with anger. "You're lying. This is a conspiracy," he roared, his voice full of fury and panic. "This damn woman is just trying to smear my name. Can't you all see it? She's a liar, a viper. She wants revenge for her father. That's the truth." He turned to the prosecutor, his eyes blazing with madness. "Do something. I'm not sitting here to let some woman make up stories about my family." The prosecutor, despite trying to maintain his composure, began to falter. He stood up, clearing his throat as if to regain control. "Your Honor, this testimony is clearly baseless. The defendant is attempting to manipulate the judicial system with unfounded and emotional accusations. There is no evidence connecting her father to this case. No evidence." A deep voice cut through the air, firm and unforgiving. The judge, an older man with sharp, piercing eyes, gripped his gavel tightly in his hand. His calm, detached demeanor had vanished. He now looked at Officer Davis, as if he were nothing more than a maggot emerging from the filth it had hidden in for years. "I was a close friend of Judge Robert Harrison. I know the details of that case, and I assure you, the defendant's words are not without merit. We will uncover the truth right here, right now." The declaration hit like a thunderclap in the already tense air. The audience in the courtroom held their breath, some leaning forward, eyes wide with anticipation and excitement. Quiet whispers spread through the room like a ripple, growing louder, like waves crashing against the walls. Officer Davis, who had just been shouting arrogantly, suddenly froze. His confidence dissolved into a mix of anger and fear. He knew all too well that if the truth came to light, everything he had worked to cover up over the years would be exposed for the world to see. Mia stood still, silent as ever, but her eyes that held the weight of everything, burned into Officer Davis like an unquenchable fire. He knew, deep down, that no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't escape. Officer Davis clenched his fists, his breath heavy and ragged, like a cornered beast. He was no longer the one in control. He was being dragged into a quagmire of his own making, a trap he couldn't escape. Mia's words, the past she had just unearthed, sliced through him like knives, tearing at the twisted pride he had carefully built over the years. "You want revenge?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom, every word grinding through clenched teeth. His eyes were bloodshot with fury. "You think just because you're the daughter of some old judge, you can make me kneel? I swear I won't let this go. You'll pay for slandering me in front of this courtroom, in front of these scumbags." Mia didn't blink, didn't even flinch. She just stared at him with eyes as cold as molten steel. And then she smiled, not in mockery, not in triumph, but with a calmness so terrifying it sent a chill through the room. "No, Officer Davis," she said in a voice as steady as a ticking clock, each word carrying the weight of unspoken power. "I don't need to seek revenge. I just want you to face yourself. Face the truth you've been running from all these years. Let's see how long a man like you can endure before everything crumbles around you." Officer Davis's teeth ground together, his jaw twitching with rage. But he couldn't retaliate. No one in that courtroom was on his side now. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, their disgust, their doubt, even a sense of vindictive satisfaction at seeing someone like him finally cornered. In a burst of anger, he leapt to his feet, shoving his chair back so violently that it toppled over. "This isn't over, you," he roared, before storming out of the courtroom, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Mia didn't follow him. She didn't even watch as he left. She simply lowered her gaze, slipped her hand into her jacket pocket, and quietly pulled out the old silver ring. Her eyes darkened, becoming as deep and endless as a bottomless pit. Officer Davis could run, he could scream, he could keep flailing against the inevitable, but it didn't matter. The game had changed, and she wouldn't stop until he was crushed beneath the weight of the very sins he had tried so hard to bury. Inside the dimly lit bar in the west end of the city, Officer Davis slumped into a chair, his fingers gripping the glass of liquor as if he wanted to crush it into pieces. His thoughts churned like a storm, and the image of Mia's eyes from the courtroom wouldn't leave him. Her gaze wasn't one of fear or submission. It was one of absolute certainty, as if she knew every dark corner of his soul. He had tried to shake it off, to convince himself it didn't matter, but the truth was, it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Around him, a tight group of police officers leaned in close, their voices low as they exchanged murmurs. These were the men who had shared in the dirt and the grime of the system, the ones who knew how to play the game. One of them, a middle-aged officer with a scruffy beard, took a long swig from his beer, his eyes scanning Officer Davis for a reaction. "So what now? You can't let that woman drag you through the mud. You're better than that, Davis," the officer said, his voice gruff but sympathetic, as though he was trying to pull his friend back from the edge. Officer Davis didn't respond right away. His grip on the glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. The anger simmered in his chest like a slow burn. But there was also something else, something darker, something that made his stomach churn with unease. He slammed the glass onto the table with such force that the liquid splashed over the sides. "She's not just trying to ruin me. This is personal," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low but seething with venom. "She's a woman scorned, bitter and twisted, and she won't stop until she takes everything from me. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it'll be gone if I let her. She's playing a dangerous game, but I'll make sure she knows the price." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. Officer Davis's words were sharp, raw, and full of fury, and they could all feel the weight of his anger in the air. Another officer, tall and silent, leaned forward and spoke in a steady, emotionless tone. "So, what's your plan, Davis?" the officer asked, his voice almost too calm. "How do you intend to stop her?" Officer Davis's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing with intent. He leaned back in his chair, his mind working quickly, calculating the next move in the game that was now set in motion. "First things first," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I want her to feel fear. I want her to understand that she's not the one in control. She thinks she can manipulate the system, but I'll show her how it really works." His words hung in the air like a promise. The group of officers nodded in quiet agreement, understanding all too well what Officer Davis was capable of when pushed to the edge. They knew the lengths he would go to, the things he would do to make sure he stayed on top. Back at her apartment, Mia wasn't surprised when her phone buzzed in the middle of the night. She had known something like this was coming. She picked up the phone, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she answered the call. The voice on the other end was heavy, labored, the kind of voice that reeked of malice. "You think you're so smart, huh?" The voice rasped, its tone dripping with contempt. Mia didn't respond immediately. She remained silent, listening carefully, her eyes scanning the shadows in the room. She could sense the presence of someone, the weight of the air around her shifting. "Don't think you can mess with someone like Officer Davis without paying the price," the voice continued, the words like a cold warning, calculated and deliberate. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This won't end well for you." Mia's hand tightened around the phone, but she didn't flinch. Her heart didn't race. She had already prepared herself for this. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. After a few seconds of silence, she finally spoke, her voice a perfect contrast to the threatening tone on the other end. "And you don't realize you're threatening the wrong person." Her words were slow, deliberate, cutting through the tension like a razor. She had no fear in her voice, no trace of hesitation. She had learned to embrace the darkness that came with standing up to someone like Officer Davis. You want to try to intimidate me? Go ahead. But know this. I'm not the one who will be crushed in the end. She hung up the phone, her heart steady, her mind sharp. But as she turned toward the window, her instincts flared. She could feel it, the chill in the air, the subtle shift in the night outside. In the darkness, a car sat idling on the street. The headlights flickered once, casting a brief glow over the quiet street before disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Mia didn't move. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there, watching, waiting. The storm had begun, and she could feel it gathering momentum. She wasn't going to back down, no matter what Officer Davis did, no matter how much he tried to destroy her. She wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. The game had already shifted, and this time, she was the one in control. The following day, Mia walked into the small, dimly lit cafe nestled in the heart of the city, a place where the air was thick with the scent of freshly ground coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. The worn wooden tables and chairs were scattered around the room, each one telling a story of years of use. She pulled her coat tightly around her, her steps purposeful and steady as she made her way toward a secluded corner. There, sitting in the shadowed space, was a man who had become an unlikely ally. Mark Holloway, an independent journalist with a reputation for exposing police corruption. He looked up from his papers through his thick glasses, his gaze sharp but not surprised. He knew why she was here. Mia didn't waste time. She placed a thick, heavy envelope on the table, her fingers tapping it once, twice, the sound echoing softly in the quiet of the cafe. Inside this is everything you need to know about Officer Davis's father, Richard Davis. He's not just a corrupt officer. He's the cornerstone of a network of dirty officials protecting him, she said, her voice low but steady, her eyes never leaving his. Mark's brow furrowed slightly as he picked up the envelope. He knew what it meant to dig into the underbelly of the system, and he didn't take these things lightly. Slowly, carefully, he opened the envelope, his fingers brushing over the contents. Inside were photographs, grainy images of Richard Davis in various compromising situations, old reports, and copies of confidential documents that detailed his illicit dealings with officials in positions of power. Each page, each image, was a key to a long-buried secret, a truth that had been hidden for far too long. This has been buried for decades, Mark muttered under his breath as he flipped through the files, his fingers trembling slightly with disbelief. Why bring this to the surface now, Mia? She didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms tightly across her chest. Her expression darkened, the weight of everything she had carried for so long settling on her shoulders. Because I want the truth to come out, she said, her voice calm but resolute. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing in her tone. She knew what she had to do. She paused for a moment, letting the tension build in the air between them before speaking again, her voice dropping to a quieter but more dangerous tone. Do you know that my father didn't just convict Richard Davis? Before the trial, Officer Davis came to my father, a suitcase full of money in hand, begging him to let his father go. But my father refused. And that decision, those words, set Officer Davis on a path of hatred, one that he's carried against my family ever since. Mark's eyes widened with shock, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just a simple case of corruption. This was personal, a vendetta, one that spanned not just years but generations. Are you sure? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. This is bigger than just one case. This is a family feud, an entire legacy of corruption and revenge. Mia's eyes, dark with the weight of a past she could never escape, never wavered. She nodded slowly. I've lived with this truth my entire life. I don't need more evidence. It's been right in front of me all this time. It's time for the world to see it. Mark sat back, still processing the magnitude of what she was asking him to do. But there was no turning back now. He knew what was at stake, and the fire in Mia's eyes made it clear that she would not stop until the truth was exposed, no matter the cost. Later that night, Mia stood alone in her small apartment, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars in the cold, silent night. She walked slowly toward the window, her fingers brushing against the edges of the silver ring she held tightly in her hand. The ring, battered and worn, reflected the dim glow of the streetlights below, its scratches marking the passage of time, the time that had led her to this moment. On the table beside her, an old photograph lay face up, its edges curled with age. It was a picture of her father, Judge Robert Harrison, in his black robes, his face stern yet full of resolve. His eyes, even in the photograph, held the weight of his decisions, of everything he had sacrificed for justice. She touched the photo gently, her fingers tracing the image of the man who had shaped her life, the man whose decisions had set everything into motion. "I will finish what you started," she whispered softly to herself, her voice thick with emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. A gust of wind suddenly rattled the window pane, the cold night air seeping through the cracks in the old glass. But Mia didn't feel the chill. The fire inside her burned hotter than ever. The storm had already begun, and she would not back down. Not now, not ever. She turned away from the window, her heart steady, her resolve unshaken. The battle that had begun years ago, the one her father had started, would now be finished by her hands. And Officer Davis, along with all the corruption he had woven into the fabric of the system, would be exposed for what he truly was. Mia knew this was just the beginning of the fight, but it was a fight she was prepared to win. And as she stared down at the old silver ring, the symbol of everything her father had stood for, she knew there was no turning back. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the darkness. A gust of cold air swept into the apartment as the living room window was forcefully pushed open from the outside. In the still of the night, heavy footsteps moved across the wooden floor, slow but deliberate. A gloved hand rifled through drawers, pulled open cabinets, scattering everything across the table, knocking books off the shelves. Papers were torn apart, drawers yanked out violently. But after a few minutes, the intruder began to grow frustrated. Nothing. In the corner, a tipped-over cabinet had caused a photo frame to fall to the floor, the glass shattering upon impact. Inside was an old picture of Mia and her father, Robert Harrison, taken on the day he sentenced Richard Davis. The photo lay trampled, a dirty boot print clearly visible on the cracked glass. Mia arrived home just as the strange car was pulling away from the end of the street. She stepped into her apartment and froze for a moment. The entire room was a wreck, everything turned over, torn apart, destroyed. But Mia wasn't scared. She took a deep breath, stepping over the shattered glass, her gaze sweeping across the room as though she had expected this all along. "They think they can make me panic, but they are wrong." A loud knock echoed at the door. Mia stiffened. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know who was standing on the other side. She opened the door, and as expected, Officer Davis. He stood there, his police uniform sharp and crisp, as though he still held absolute power. But this time his eyes were different, dark, endless, like an abyss. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't arrogant. He simply stared at her, his voice low, a deadly warning lacing his words. "You don't know who you're up against." Mia squinted, standing her ground, not stepping back an inch. She didn't need to know. She only needed to know one thing. He was afraid. He turned to leave, but not before leaving one last remark. "Don't let this go too far, Mia. There will be consequences." She watched him disappear into the night, then immediately slammed the door shut and pulled out her phone. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surging through her veins. When the phone picked up, she didn't waste any time. "Release it. Right now." Mark's article exploded across every news outlet the following morning. The headline blared, "Son of corrupt cop takes revenge on the daughter of justice." Within hours, social media erupted. Excerpts from the articles spread at lightning speed, and thousands of enraged comments piled up under posts. Mia and Officer Davis's conflict was no longer just a personal rivalry. It had become a symbol of the rot within the system. Outside the police department, an angry crowd had gathered. Signs were raised high. "Justice for Mia Harrison. End police corruption." The chants echoed through the streets, each wave swelling like a rising tide. News crews swarmed in, reporters jostling for positions to capture the live footage. This was no longer the story of one person. It had evolved into a battle between the people and those who abused their power. Inside the police headquarters, Officer Davis stood frozen in front of the TV screen where images of the protest flashed, showing the faces of the angry crowd. Cold sweat trickled down his temples as the office door suddenly swung open. His captain stepped inside, his expression as cold as steel. "Davis, you're being suspended while an investigation takes place." Officer Davis whipped around, his voice thick with anger. "What? They can't do this to me. I didn't do anything wrong." But the captain's gaze remained unwavering. "Your records have been dug up. Your father's passed, too. If you have any sense left, you'll keep quiet before this gets any worse." Officer Davis couldn't believe it. The walls were closing in on him, and it was all because of her. That woman, Mia Harrison, had somehow pushed him to this breaking point. He gritted his teeth, clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes filled with a combination of panic and rage. He wouldn't let her win. Officer Davis's mind raced, every thought consumed by how to get back at her, how to destroy her the way she had tried to destroy him. The feeling of powerlessness ate at him, but he would not be brought down. He had been on top for too long, and he would claw his way back, no matter the cost. The courtroom was packed to capacity that day. The benches were overflowing with not only concerned citizens, but also a swarm of reporters, television journalists, and protesters still seething from the demonstration outside the police department. They were all here to witness Officer Davis being exposed, to see the man who had once stood above the law now kneel before justice. Officer Davis sat in the defendant's chair, his eyes burning with hatred, though he couldn't hide the tension that gripped him. He was used to being the predator, but now he was the prey. His police uniform was gone, replaced by a disheveled suit. When the judge banged his gavel to begin the proceedings, Officer Davis took a deep breath, but his palms were still sweating cold. Mia stepped up to the witness stand, her back straight, her eyes unflinching. She was no longer the oppressed woman, no longer the weak one backed into a corner. She opened her mouth, her voice clear, each word heavy with the weight of truth. "Officer Davis is not just an abusive cop. He has harbored a grudge against my family since I was a child. He doesn't care about upholding justice. He cares about revenge." She recounted that night when Officer Davis had illegally handcuffed her, when he stood outside her home threatening her. But then her voice lowered, and her eyes flickered with the memory of an old wound. "My father, Judge Robert Harrison, was threatened by him 20 years ago. Officer Davis came to my father's office with a suitcase full of money, begging him to spare his father, Richard Davis. When my father refused, Officer Davis swore that one day he would destroy us." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew unbearably tense. The audience had fallen silent, their eyes wide in shock. Some quietly wiped away tears, feeling the weight of a grudge that had spanned generations, a wound that had never healed. Suddenly, the judge nodded, signaling for something. The door to the courtroom swung open, and a man with silver hair walked in, his face etched with the burden of many years. He stood at the center of the room, cleared his throat, and then spoke. "I am Michael Pearson. I was a colleague of Richard Davis, Officer Davis's father." Officer Davis stiffened in his seat, his eyes bulging with disbelief as he locked eyes with the man before him. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, but the judge slammed his gavel down, demanding order. Michael Pearson continued, his voice slow but resolute. "I've stayed silent for 20 years, but today I can no longer remain quiet. I stand here to tell the truth." The room fell completely still. He took a deep breath and continued. "I once heard Officer Davis swear that he would destroy the Harrison family. He never forgot what his father endured, and he has waited every day to make that promise a reality." The courtroom erupted. The public roared in fury, and reporters scrambled to capture every moment. Officer Davis completely lost control. He shot up from his seat, screaming like a man possessed. "Shut up. You don't know anything. I'm the one who's been betrayed. I should never be sitting here." But no one listened to him anymore. The prosecutor turned to the judge, his voice firm and final. "Your Honor, we have enough evidence to charge Officer Davis with abuse of power, unlawful detention, and a personal motive for seeking revenge." Officer Davis continued to scream, thrashing in his seat, but deep down, he knew it. This time, there was no escape. The next afternoon, Mark arrived at Mia's apartment, his usual sharp demeanor replaced by an unusual heaviness in his expression. He placed an old, weathered envelope before her, his eyes avoiding hers as though the burden he carried was too heavy to share. The silence between them felt thick, charged with unspoken words. Mia raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued, and slowly opened the letter. The yellowed paper was fragile, the edges worn from age, but the handwriting within was still clear and sharp. As she read the first few lines, her breath caught in her throat, and her hands began to tremble. Mia, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here. But there is a truth you need to know. I forgave Richard Davis. I never made this public because I knew that if I did, you would become the target of hatred. The weight of her father's words hit her like a tidal wave. She could hardly comprehend what she was reading. Her father, the stoic and unyielding man she had always admired and respected, had chosen to forgive the very person who had caused so much pain, who had torn her life apart, the person who had stood as a constant symbol of everything that had been unjust in her life. She clenched the letter tightly in her hand, feeling the words crash over her, each sentence a jagged rock against her chest. Her mind raced, unable to fully process the reality that had been hidden from her for so long. Her father, a man she had thought of as the unwavering pillar of justice, had chosen mercy. He had buried the truth of his forgiveness to protect her, to shield her from the very forces of vengeance that now threatened to engulf her. The man she had thought of as indestructible had chosen silence so that she would remain safe from the wrath of Officer Davis and his father. The truth that had been hidden from her for so many years, the truth that might have changed everything, had been kept from her to protect her innocence. Her lips quivered, the tears she had fought to keep at bay finally spilling over. She whispered softly to herself, her voice barely audible. You chose silence. To protect me. The realization tore through her, flooding her with a cocktail of emotions. Admiration for her father's courage, pain for the secrets that had been kept from her, and guilt for the weight of his choice. Did he really think I couldn't handle the truth? The conflict within her surged, leaving her both lost and somehow more determined than ever before. The following day, Mia stood in front of the cold, imposing walls of the prison where Officer Davis was being held. The sound of her heels clicking on the concrete echoed in the silence as she walked into the sterile, whitewashed building. She had no fear in her heart, only the clarity of purpose that had been instilled in her by a lifetime of witnessing the effects of betrayal, pain, and vengeance. She stepped into the sterile room where Officer Davis was waiting, his eyes hollow and defeated, his posture slumped in a way that was unfamiliar to her. She had seen him as a predator for so long, but now the roles had reversed, and the predator was now the prey. Officer Davis was seated at a metal table, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes cast downward, staring at nothing. He looked broken, so much so that Mia almost felt the flicker of something like sympathy. But the emotions she had spent years cultivating, anger, resolve, a burning need for justice, told her otherwise. She placed the letter down in front of him without a word. Officer Davis's eyes shot up, narrowing in confusion as he looked at her, his expression hardening into a scowl. "What's this?" he spat, his voice gruff with disbelief. Mia didn't flinch. She held his gaze, unblinking, her voice low and unwavering. "It's the truth you've been running from. My father forgave your father, but you didn't." Officer Davis stared at the letter, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch it. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the words. As he read the lines, the room seemed to grow heavier, the silence thickening. His face hardened, but his jaw clenched, the tension in his body growing palpable. For a moment, Officer Davis, the man who had tortured and terrorized so many, the man who thought he had everything under control, looked vulnerable, broken, like a child facing the consequences of a lifetime of wrongs. Then, without warning, he broke down. It wasn't a cry of anger or regret over being caught. It was the cry of a man whose entire world had just crumbled, a man who had spent years feeding the fire of hatred only to have it consumed by the very truth he had spent so long trying to bury. "I knew," he whispered, his voice cracking, the words tumbling from his mouth in a broken confession. "I knew your father didn't hate my family, but I chose hate because it was easier. It was easier than facing the fact that I was nothing but a shadow of my father, a man who never lived up to what was expected. I was a failure, a puppet of the past." Mia stood in front of him, her eyes locked on his, but there was no satisfaction, no triumph in her gaze. Instead, there was only sorrow, quiet, silent sorrow. She had watched him fall, watched as his pride shattered, but she didn't feel the vindication she had once imagined. Instead, she only felt the weight of her father's silence pressing down on her and the realization that perhaps vengeance was never truly the answer. Mia stepped out of the prison, the gray sky above matching the storm brewing in her heart. She had done what she set out to do. She had confronted Officer Davis, exposed the truth, and yet there was no relief, no closure. She knew she could have released the letter, let the world know what kind of man her father had truly been. But she hadn't. Her father's forgiveness wasn't meant to be a weapon. It wasn't meant to be a tool to seek revenge or to prove a point to anyone. It was a personal choice, a lesson she would carry with her, one that didn't need to be flaunted for the world to see. She took off the old silver ring, holding it tightly in her hand one last time. The hatred ends here. With those words, she placed the ring gently on the ground, letting it lie there, a silent symbol of the past she had carried for so long and a quiet promise to herself that she would let it go. As she walked away, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sense of relief, a peace she had never known before. For the first time in many years, Mia felt truly free. The weight of the past lifted from her shoulders, her heart lighter than it had ever been. The chains of vengeance had finally broken, and she was free to live the life she had always deserved. Mia left the old city early one misty morning when the streets were still shrouded in a light fog. She didn't look back, not even once, not holding on to the past or any regrets. She had fought, she had reclaimed justice, and now she was ready for a new beginning. A small coastal town welcomed her with gentle breezes and the sound of waves crashing on the shore. Here, she no longer had to watch every step, no longer had to live in the shadow of her past. She started a new job at a nonprofit, helping people who had been wrongfully convicted, people like she had once been. She wasn't seeking revenge. She simply wanted to bring true justice. As time passed, Mia wrote a book about her father, a book not to expose or unearth the past, but to honor his integrity. She wrote about the man who had chosen forgiveness over revenge, the lessons he had left behind in true courage. The book quickly garnered attention, not because of the police scandals or the famous trials, but because of the story of a man who had placed justice above all, even when it meant making silent sacrifices. One day, she received a letter from the prestigious law school where her father had once taught. They wanted to name a lecture hall after him, Robert Harrison, a symbol of justice and professional ethics. When the memorial ceremony took place, Mia stood before her father's portrait, her eyes misting over, but a smile graced her lips. She gently touched the frame, her voice barely a whisper but filled with pride. "I did it, Dad." The memories flooded back, taking her back to her childhood when she would sit on her father's lap, listening to him explain the meaning of justice. Justice is meant to heal, not destroy. His deep, warm voice echoed in her mind. Back then, she had been too young to fully grasp the meaning of those words, but now she understood them more than ever. Elsewhere, in the confines of his small cell, Officer Davis sat alone, reading Mia's book. He no longer screamed, no longer harbored hatred for the world. The pages turned slowly under his trembling hands, and for the first time in many years, he wept, not from fear or anger, but from realizing everything he had lost. He couldn't change the past, but he could begin to make amends. That afternoon, Mia stood on the beach, the ocean breeze tousling her hair. The endless blue of the sea stretched out before her, much like the road ahead, open, unburdened by the chains of the past. She no longer carried hatred, no longer felt pain. She was free. From a distance, the camera pulled back, capturing Mia walking along the shore, her figure small yet resolute. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, "You are free." As this story comes to an end, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being here, for watching, for feeling every emotion, and for standing with Mia in her journey for justice, truth, and redemption. This isn't just a story about one woman's fight. It's a reflection of the struggles so many people face in a world where injustice often prevails. But as Mia showed us, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about healing, about breaking the cycle of hatred, and about choosing to move forward even when the past tries to hold you back. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, feel, or even question the world around you, then don't let it stop here. Like, share, and leave a comment to spread this message further. Let's create a space where powerful stories are told, where voices are heard, and where we remind each other that justice is never truly out of reach. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Journey for more deeply moving, thought-provoking stories. Because every story has a lesson, and every voice has the power to inspire change. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.